a major Google update can have a dramatic impact, positive and negative, across hundreds of brands. And we internally scrabble around trying to decipher and reverse engineer what happened, how we should change how we operate.
You've got to build content that isn't necessarily just for Google. And I think the best place to do that is on smaller, more focused niche websites.
Hello and welcome to the Game Business Show with me, Christopher Dring. A few weeks ago, we ran a story on the stark drop in the number of articles being produced by the games media, which was tied to a significant decline in the number of professionals writing about video games. This made me want to dig a little bit deeper into this area of the industry and speak to some of the leaders in this space, which is exactly what I've done. I obviously have a vested interest in this area myself. Now, we're specifically looking at the traditional games media here. There's a whole other conversation around influencers, content creators, and streamers to be had. But for this episode, we're drilling in on the traditional side of things. And you don't get much more traditional than our first subject. Future Publishing is the oldest games media business with a history in magazines, and it still makes magazines to this day. But it's probably best known for Games Radar, PC Gamer, and the Future Games Show. I caught up with Dawkins, who has been at the company for 25 years in various leadership roles and is currently content director for games, video, and digital events. And I wanted to get his view on the challenges of writing about video games in 2025. Here's Dan. What are the biggest challenges as a games media organization that you're facing today?
Where do I begin? The challenges are myriad. And I think we're facing the same challenge I think a lot of people in media are facing. And I think the same challenge a lot of people making games are making. We're in an attention economy where there's never been more noise, less context. The rise of AI creates more duplication and distortion. And I guess we are, like anyone, trying to carve our space and our audience within all of that. So I guess to sort of drill a bit deeper, like the things that are very much on my mind are, there's too many games. I struggle to have enough time to play them. I'm a professional games journalist. It's just too much. The games industry itself is going through a difficult phase, perhaps coming out the other side of it. But I always think in games that I guess somebody's problem is everybody's problem, because we're a very dependent ecosystem. And that might not always be apparent, but on the right timeline, I think we all face up showing these challenges. Then, for media, we've been facing a challenge for, I guess, going back 20 years, where we've essentially become like a Google dependency. And that's another set of conversations and really could go quite deep into it. But the fact that so much media is, I guess, Google or Discovery dependent, and whatever the whims of those algorithms are, it is almost the sort of the tale of the modern media age. For better or for worse. And I think there's been lots of responses to that we could sort of get into and talk about. And I guess on top of all of that, you're then throwing this sort of AI. What is it? Is it the apocalypse? Is it a new age? Is it a false dawn? Who knows yet, right? But I think it would be deeply naive to say that's going away. And, I think a lot of people have been very quick to dismiss it. I don't think it's going away. Like, I think enough people with a vested interest in making it happen that there will be some new adjustment to whatever that means to us.
Is this Google dependency? Is this just the reality of it? Is there no way of breaking that?
Yeah, I think that the fact that we were so exposed, and I mean, we are a really large media organization, like Future PLC reaches something like, I think, like 1 in 3 adults globally. So we have to think about this problem a lot. And we were probably, like many media organizations, Google overexposed. So I think we've consciously, and this is perhaps over the last decade, wrestled with like other routes to get people to. There's quite a wise phrase that I read from someone at The Guardian, who was one of their media strategists, who said, platforms are not strategies. And I think that if you've over-indexed on the success on a certain platform at a certain point in time, you're almost just waiting for that bubble to pop. And I think we've seen that with different platforms over the last 10 years. So I think we've become much better at, I'm not saying perfect, because everyone's still, another truism of media, so I feel like I'm waiting for the day when things settle down. And it's been 25 years, so I think I've learned that's never going to happen. So we've just diversified a lot more. So I think we find, even for our websites, we find increasingly more routes to get the audience there, whether that's traditional social media, Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, or even more community-led routes like Steam or Reddit, Google Discover. We're just finding that whilst Google's still a core part of what we do, and that's Google search traffic primarily, diversifying our traffic has made like our models a lot more robust.
Mm-hmm. It's still an advertising dominant market. The days where, Future could make a significant chunk of its money selling magazines or subscriptions to anything, I guess, is in the past. I'm just saying those words knowing it's true and asking you if it's true.
Yeah, well, I will point out we are still publishing magazines and good magazines, but I will not tell a lie and say that they are the ascendant media delivery medium. Of course they're not, but we, like every publisher, have been, I guess, quite exposed to, like I say, to Google and to the ad monetization model.
Yes.
So we've been forced to diversify. And I think for Future particularly, I think we were one of the first media companies, I guess, because truthfully, going back about 10 years, Future was in quite a difficult place. And we were forced to really re-examine what our audience wanted, how we delivered it, and how we operated as a company. Obviously, I would say this because I work for Future, but at the same time, I've got to be upfront and say it was really hard. But like we did a great job, I think, at understanding the value of what we create. And I think that was why when Future probably pivoted hard and earlier than other publishers into e-commerce. And I'm talking, about the gaming brands, but also wider Future. And that turned out to be like a massive engine of success for us. And it still continues to be, but I think like any market, once people can see success somewhere else, everyone piles in and it becomes more competitive. But so e-commerce has been a really powerful strand for us and continues to be. And obviously a big strand for us now is the rise of the digital showcases.
Yes.
I guess reaching outside of our core platforms.
Stick on Google for a little bit longer. The helpful content updates, everyone's favorite thing. How has that affected you?
Well, I feel like we could have this conversation at any point in the last 3 years, and I would say a different thing to you.
Yeah.
There's been a variety of content updates. I mean, the big movement within Google in the last sort of 3 years maybe has been this drive for like EAT or EEAT, like expertise, experience, authority, and trust. And I guess like Google wanting you to show your workings out and to explain why you've done something and how you did it and show pictures of what you did. This is, again, notionally what Google asked for. Is it the reality of what they prioritize? It's hard to know. An experience of a large organization like us is like a major Google update can have a dramatic impact, positive and negative, across our hundreds of brands. And then we internally scrabble around trying to decipher and, you'll know what this is like, to decipher and reverse engineer what happened and how we should change how we operate. And I guess like cutting a long story short, like I feel like we could have like skipped a year and ended up at the same place quite often. And this is the craziness of it. So, and this goes back to what I was saying about platforms not being strategies. At the heart of all of games media, like we were saying off air, I've been doing this since 2001. What is still true is what do the audience want? Why do they come to you? What's the trust? What are you delivering you're not getting elsewhere? I think it's too easy to lose sight of that and to get obsessed about the algorithm problem of the day or the platform challenge of the day.
But what role do you see yourself, the media, sort of playing in sort of unearthing and discovering new titles? And I guess this might tie to what you're about to say about your showcases.
Yeah, 100% that, because I think it's perhaps a misconception or a thing that was true for a while of websites would only cover the big games because that's what traffics. And, we get a lot of PRs saying it's really hard to get our game covered. And I guess the truth of that is, I guess if you ran a website that only covered unknown indie games, and, you'd know this. And like if you wrote the headlines in a way that weren't trying really, really hard to encourage the new audience, you just wouldn't have a model because the interest isn't there and it's too hard to monetize. And you could argue maybe there's a newsletter in that or a different type of discovery thing. But for the traditional web model, that wasn't working. So I think a lot of web media pivoted to big games, game guides, deeper on the big games. But I think we found increasingly that game discovery for us is being delivered through social video, whether that's on Games Radar, PC Gamer, or across something like the Future Game Show, which is like a big digital game showcase that we launched 5 years ago now, which is crazy to even say. And even within the company at the time felt like a tremendous punt. And it was essentially myself and the producer, James Jarvis. We felt that we were running it on our own, making it, selling it, creating it, marketing it. But, it went well and it's kept going well. And it's sort of steamrolled to this point where we're getting 13 million live viewers a show. It's like I was saying to you off air, it's my every waking moment of thinking about these shows. But what we've zeroed in on is the idea of the shows are all about discovering new games. And we work really hard to curate each show, to pick games that we think, I guess the games of tomorrow we think the audience are going to love. I know that sounds quite vainglorious or highfalutin, but you work in media enough, you get a smell for what you think a good game is. And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But for example, we had Blueprints, that's one of this year's GOTY contenders. I didn't even know myself. We debuted that in the Future Game Show last year. So I came out and I went, why haven't we talked about this Blueprints? And you're like, oh, right, we literally did.
Yeah.
So we see very much the role of the shows as, bringing those cool games to the audience.
So you do consider it like still the role of the media in one way, shape or form to enable discovery and sort of support the industry in that way? Because that's the question, talking to different people the other day. I was going, maybe it's not the media's job to worry about discoverability. Ultimately, it's got to service its readers, but clearly it's something that is important to you.
It's an interesting question because I guess it depends on, again, how you define the media, the platforms that the media chooses to play in. In all of this conversation, the role of, say, YouTube and video and its effect on what would be trad media is perhaps the big dialogue. Like I look at my kids and they just watch videos. They only watch YouTube. My elder child watches some Instagram, but like really they're entirely video literate. They discover everything through the lens of YouTube. There's hundreds of brands purporting to offer game discovery or within niches. YouTube is sort of catering to all of this. But then the problem becomes there's so many people offering to save you time and curating things that you almost need a curation of the curators, which might be an opportunity for somebody. And I think that's actually where there is a role for trad media. I guess I don't know what it means, trad media, but like someone with traditional journalistic skills of deciding what is important and I guess curating what they believe to be the most presentable version people would chime with and sharing that with people. That goes to the heart of, I guess, what brands are, what does your brand promise to do and how does it deliver it? And I guess also, what do you as a journalist, what do you think you're uniquely good at? And I think that we're in an age now where people can be uniquely good at very niche or bizarre things, and that's enough. You've probably heard the Kevin Kelly theory of 1,000 true fans.
Yes.
Yeah, where, essentially, if you've got 1,000 true fans, that's all you need to really have a career and a life. And I think that's true in the digital age. But, at the same time, you've got that competing against, I guess, with what Future Party represents, this sort of multi-million audience Leviathan. So, we're trying to straddle all those worlds, but it's difficult.
Really? Final question. How do you see the games media looking by 2030, shall we say?
I was asked this question at a conference the other day, and I'll probably give the same answer. I would say this side of a genuine AI Mageddon, where, somehow everything pivots to this crazy AI-led model, which I always feel that stuff's slightly oversold. I think it will look broadly similar. I just think we'll have an accelerating trend of, like you've said, I guess like a certain tier of media organizations might find it harder and harder. There'll be sort of consolidation. And I think from that comes fragmentation. And then, for people like yourself who are able to spin off and create projects like this, it already feels that we have quite an established ecosystem of people like yourself who are doing newsletters, who are doing YouTube channels. Will there be a stage where that's peak solo newsletter creator, different analysts, that sort of thing? I don't know. But I see that trend happening as maybe really good, talented people spin out of trad media organizations. A lot of them will be seeking, whether it's consultancy or more public facing stuff. I think that will happen. The interesting thing for me is, having seen a bit through the arc of time, is how traditional games media sees its role within this space. And I guess within the evolving role of what YouTube can deliver, which is kind of everything. And I think there was probably a trend in games media, maybe going back sort of 5 to 10 years ago, where it felt like the only journalism people wanted to do was like grown-up journalism, which seemed to become solely about, I guess, like culture issues, wider social issues, and employment issues that are really important things. But a lot of the stuff that when I used to work in magazines was like, we're just going to obsess about what would be the Elden Ring of the day, right? Or whatever it was. And except that the grown-up thing was just being really crazy and nerdy about something essentially stupid. Because for a lot of people in games, that's what their relationship with games is. My kids don't know about any of the wider ecosystem and maybe never will. They just want to play fun games for an escape or to play with their friends. And I wonder how trad media will engage or re-engage with that. Or is that something that's permanently now belonging in the realms of influencers and YouTubers? I say that as someone who works on a weekly Grand Theft Auto 6 show. We've done 67 episodes and there's been one trailer. So consider that, right?
Yeah.
And we're never short of things. I feel like we're never short of things to talk about. But that's crazy.
Mm.
I personally enjoy that type of stuff. That sort of nerdy obsessionism and escape, I think is really cool. And like whether the media moves back towards that or finds some sort of middle ground, I guess it's finding the voice of media will be an interesting thing to watch, perhaps as much as the platforms. Is AI going to wash us away? That sort of thing.
You can probably tell that we did that interview before the second trailer drop for Grand Theft Auto 6. So hopefully Dan and the team has another year's worth of stuff to talk about on his GTA podcast. Now, our next interview subject is also a major media player in the form of Fandom. Fandom operates GameSpot, Metacritic, and GameFAQs, but is probably best known for hosting thousands of pop culture wikis, some of them official and some of them not. They're a little more of a user-generated media brand, so quite different to Future in that regard, but no less significant. Now, Fandom did own another games website called Giant Bomb, which it put on pause just over a week ago, and they have since allowed the publication to go independent. We unfortunately conducted our interview with Fandom before the Giant Bomb story took place, so if you're wondering why we don't talk about it, that's why. Anyway, here is Fandom's CEO, Perkins Miller. What are the biggest challenges you're facing at the moment as a media organization or just pop culture organization? I don't know what term you use.
It's great to see you, Christopher. I think the biggest challenges that, we face is one, can we make sure the products and platforms we build are in service to these communities who are passionate about gaming? So we have wikis that hundreds of thousands of people are updating every day about the games they love and making sure that those tools work well and they're easy to use. We want to make sure that audiences can find them. So, we're very well ranked by Google because we have 50 million pages of content. And so wikis and blogs that are created in support of a game, whether it's a game guide or what the latest DLC is all about, or we've built these maps that allow you to figure out where you are in a game. We have to make sure that we're building the right tools for the right experiences for our platforms because we're user generated on the core for the hundreds of thousands of creators. And then we have, 280, 300 million people that come every month to, consume the content across the platform. So just making sure you get that right, I think is job one. Discovery is, I think as these, platforms that are, sourcing traffic, whether it's Google or now AI or social, you have to be on your toes to make sure that you're out there and accessible effectively for people who are trying to discover the content they love. And, that also, cuts across our other businesses. And we've built this series of experiences to serve these communities of gamers. And we have an e-commerce business. So we want to make sure that we're getting the right games at the right price. We have media platforms and Metacritic and GameSpot and Giant Bomb. And we want to make sure that the content that's created is relevant and, again, discoverable by Google or, making sure that AI is pointing folks to get the right experience. So I think those are the two things. We build the platforms in the right way to help people discover the content they need. And then that discovery process, whether it's from social or AI or search, do we make sure that the platforms are discoverable themselves so that people can get to the content they love?
I'm in the business media, but I used to be part of Gamer Network. I knew some of the challenges they were facing with things like changes to Google algorithms, the advertising landscape shifting. I guess it's a little bit different for a wiki type business, but the release schedule being inconsistent could dictate whether or not they had a good year or a bad year. And then there's a lot of concerns about AI and it basically not necessarily having to leave Google to find out how to beat that boss in that game. But you didn't list any of those. So is that an indicator that those are things that are a little bit more out of your control, or is it that you're already working around those sort of things or embracing them in some cases?
Well, I think the good thing about our business, about Fandom, is that we're somewhat less sensitive to the fluctuations in the release cycle for gaming because, roughly 85% of our audience comes to Fandom's wikis or comes to GameFAQs for games that have been around for anywhere from 2 to 20 years. So, whether you're playing Minecraft or Call of Duty COD, or you're trying to figure out a way to, get around on Skyrim. There are games that are in the market that we provide an enormous resource for people who are now have purchased the game or playing it or have been playing it for years and just need some extra support. And so that's 85% of that traffic goes, on what we call evergreen basis to that content. Yeah. The business that's around release schedules, whether it's fanatical for the games that are being released or news coverage, which, is on, Giant Bomb or more directly GameSpot and Metacritic, that certainly fluctuates based on the game release cycle. We for sure are going to have our impact like everybody else is, but I think we've been the fortunate thing because we have these platforms that are much broader in terms of servicing audiences at scale across the sort of legacy of gaming, we're a little bit less sensitive to the fluctuations of the market in that way.
What about the sort of AI side? My former colleague says, honestly, for them, people stealing their content is more stressful than AI for them at the moment. But is that something that you're mindful of or concerned about? And I mean, people like Google scouring your publication and putting it up in a platform that you can't necessarily monetize.
I think AI, is certainly a threat of sorts, particularly to commoditized news and information, things that are quick answers that don't require a lot of kind of detail in terms of discovery. And it varies, right? So whether you're using Perplexity or one of the GPTs from OpenAI, or you're working on somebody else's, agentic model that maybe, anchored to Llama. I think there's so many different ways to kind of get to different content that users are still figuring it out. So I think we're very much in the early days of it. And I think news businesses, we're just a very singular, is a game out, how much is it cost? Things are very simple in terms of their query. I think potentially, just as Google was always some risk in that way, AI for sure is a risk in that in terms of how people are going to learn. And right now, though, what we find is that for the blogs or the wikis that people dig in on, there's so much density and detail there that people really love to dig into that it tends to be a destination that people spend more time at beyond what the AI may serve them. So we're currently seeing actually a decent amount of referral traffic from the AI platforms. And we haven't seen a real much degradation from Google, even with their AI results bar, a box that sits at the top, which we call AIO, which is, and we think of AI optimization to that. So we haven't seen that quite as much. So I think it really depends on, to some degree, the content you're sourcing. And I think it also depends on, again, can you log where you are in a game on a map in AI? You can't. You can do that on Fandom. If you're trying to sort of find your way through sequentially a game guide or try to read about a DLC and sort of figure out what do I need, or figuring out what kind of weapons you may have missed along the way. If you don't really know kind of the question of the prompt in AI, that's, again, it's simple, maybe commoditized information. You sort of just need to learn. It's not a great tool if you don't know the prompt. And so when you get to the wiki, you're kind of in the game environment. And so you can go dig in and get immersed in that. And I think that's typically what we're seeing in the experience still sustaining. Now, that obviously can change. And I'm a believer in only the paranoid survive. So I think we have to make sure we're considering that. But right now, that's their experience is something that we haven't seen as much impact across the core wikis or blogs because of the content density.
It's interesting. Obviously, I run a business publication. I know that you're answerable to your audience, right? That's what's most important to you. And the industry's got this discoverability crisis going on, and they're looking at the games media to say, hey, can you cover my game? Can you help surface my game? But meanwhile, you've got that challenge where, you're about that Google traffic and you're trying to drive those numbers. And the things that deliver those numbers isn't interesting indie game X or interesting AA game Y. It's GTA 6. It's those big tentpole titles. It's Elden Ring. It's those sort of games that are delivering you the things you need and is what your audience is looking for and what your audience is asking for. Meanwhile, the industry is trying to find the discovery channel. There's a problem in the games industry where there's a discoverability crisis. There's a media that's becoming increasingly focused on the bigger games that are already being played by millions and millions of people. Is there a solution here that can be found? I don't know.
It's a good statement, though, and I think it's right that there were almost 20,000 games released to Steam last year, and there's not the discovery mechanics. Whether you can think about with enough wish listing, and are there games that were released in alpha that people test, and then does that give a sense of when it, But I think the dynamic of how do you go to market with a game is really difficult, as you say, because the volume is so high. And I think with AI tools that enable games to be created more easily, if not more quickly, it's only going to mean more, particularly sort of, AA, AAA games that are going to be in the market over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. What we've built and we, think will be helpful is that one, you come to the team, you create a wiki, we can help you, with data and insights about, here's how, the best way to create this content and be able to publish your game on our core platform. We have Fanatical and e-commerce business. We can help you sell it. So we can figure out, if you're thinking about pricing and promotion, we can help you on that front because we're in the market with affiliates. And, we can't review every game, but, certainly you can say, where is the game on the, how do we think about, game guides? You can have a game guide built on GameFAQs. So there's ways to do it. And so I would just encourage the, communities, we encourage the community to kind of come to us and say, hey, we can help you, use some of the tools we have at our disposal to play the game or to get the game promoted.
The answer to that from your side is to create the tools so that people can sort of do it themselves. I guess they need their community to do it rather than it being necessarily a corporate run. I don't actually know how that works. Do you allow for, sorry if it's an ignorant question, for developers and publishers to set up their own wikis and things like that? I guess you do. I do know. Actually, I did know that answer.
Yeah. We welcome the the studio or the publisher to build a wiki, an official wiki, so that they can make sure that they get the game description that's clear and a guide and deployed, and they can put the assets in so you can see what it's like. You can figure out what weapons you need. I mean, we have databases. If you wanted to build one that would hang off, that would give, again, the index of all the weapons or tools, depending on the game you've got to build. So we absolutely encourage it. And it's super helpful because then people, as they start to play the game, they can use it as everybody does, as a reference tool to figure out kind of where they are and, how to play the game better or get over an obstacle, that they can't play around right now.
Do you ever foresee a time where we're not quite so reliant on advertising to sort of fund our world?
Subscription media can work, and there's obvious examples of it. In the US, both Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have a decent business. Puck is a very bespoke business in certain segments. I think certain areas where you have a information that's so esoteric and probably an audience that is relatively small, but willing to pay for that esoteric information, I think that the subscription business generally works. Or you've got an organization like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, big news engines. And if you believe, like I do, that there's a good commitment to journalism there, and I think it's worth paying for. I think in the gaming business, see the conversation we were having just a moment ago with, 18,000 games with, there's 150,000 plus legacy games that are in the market. People are looking to discover, a new experience, or maybe their friend referenced something that they're trying to figure out. It lends itself to wanting to have open access, right? It just is like, you want to have the lowest barrier to entry as possible so that people can get the information they want. And so the balance to that is, if you want to have the broadest amount of content, we have 50 million pages of content accessible to everybody in the world at any time. To put a paywall up in front of that is a pretty huge hurdle, especially if someone's just trying to figure out, like, I just bought Skyrim. I'm trying to figure this one thing out. Am I going to pay $1 or $2, whatever it may be, just to get that information when I can't even look at it in advance to understand whether it's going to be helpful to me? That's a very big hurdle to clear. even if the money amount sounds trivial, most people will go try to find the information somewhere else. So advertising, what it does is it just offsets that expense so that they can get access and sample. Be like, I'm doing this one thing. I just want to see, do I need this information? And I think there is opportunity as we build up other experiences. You're referencing, the guides or tools. I mean, we're working on these game guide utilities. We're working with AI to sort of figure out, like, is there a way to create a utility for people that's powered by insight? So as they're playing the game, they can literally, via voice or text, get the information they want quickly. And would a tool that is dynamic in that way, would you pay for that to be a companion to you in your gameplay? Maybe, but I think it's got to be such a specific, again, bespoke utility that you absolutely need and going to use regularly, as opposed to wanting to say, hey, look, we want to have the broadest access for the largest number of people. In that case, advertising is the kind of better mechanic for funding that.
Now the games media is getting smaller. We've seen cuts like across the business. Budgets are tighter, but there are all these sort of new areas and opportunities. I guess that's a real challenge in trying to sort of chase that new stuff, but with ultimately limited resources.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as I said, you have to be responsive to the change. I think that's where it's very difficult, because I think, audiences, you have to just follow where the audiences are going. If audiences are on TikTok, you have to make sure you're calibrated. If audiences are consuming video on YouTube, what's your YouTube presence? If, how do you make sure your wikis are as discoverable as possible? If you're creating content that's video, how do you distribute it in a way that is most efficient? And the models are going to change. I mean, it just will. And I think, I think right now the large platforms are very, very impactful on user attention. And I think that's very different from what it was 10 years ago, when it was really kind of Google as the predominant distributor with a little bit of Facebook, and you could kind of figure out how to get audiences off of Facebook. But now we're in a world where that walled garden of Facebook is very, very high, and they keep the audiences there. And Google's, competing now against the face of AI chatbots and generative agentic platforms. So, I think that's the real trick to this whole thing, is that you have to be able to sort of figure out where you are and change your model. And that's why we have an e-commerce business. That's why, we believe in the wiki. We believe in user-generated content. How do we make it easier? We believe to make sure, ratings and recommendations, the real kind of true utility. That's like we think that's a real powerful tool for people, and they're going to always need it. So those sort of things are kind of how how we see the world kind of evolving in the next, at least a couple of years.
Well, I was going to ask that, and I realized I'm out of time. So maybe you've already answered the question, which is, what does the future hold? How do you see things by 2030? I
mean, right now we have the forces. You read Matthew Ball's stuff, and there's various analyses that are done on the state of the industry. And, I think right now, as I said, PC gaming is surprisingly strong and healthy. And I think actually PC gaming and cloud-based gaming are probably going to be very strong going forward. I think the console business is really tough. I think mobile will continue to be an area of strength, but not an area of depth. And so just because of the form factor, I think there'd be some depth to it, but, the casual gaming side of mobile will always be there. But, in terms of franchise support, I think PC gaming, cloud-based gaming, is going to be particularly material. I think mobile will be a very central part to that. But that's where I think the fact is AI will accelerate development and make development more sophisticated, and make sure, like, for example, if you got to, figure out DPI in a different way as you're creating a game, or you got to get your frame rate speeds to, optimize for different, CPUs on different devices. It'll be easier to do that effectively. So I think you're going to see more games produced. It's going to be easier to sort of release cross-platform. I think PC and mobile and cloud are going to be central to it. And I think it's going to be, discoverability is going to be a crux challenge, so how do you find the game you really want to play? And I think that's where the ability to sort of have community and have social, because those are the ways that people will discover content predominantly. Playing in those spaces will be vital from a sort of a developer studio standpoint.
One of the things interesting about Fandom is that its wikis allow it to go deep. It can delve right into individual franchises and games and look at the lore and everything associated with them. Of course, it's mostly user-generated content, and sometimes the firm's offerings aren't what the fan bases are actually after, but generally, Fandom is able to go niche. And Future is similar, really, in some ways, although more on the traditional journalism side. It has a magazine about retro gaming, has a website about PC gaming, it has a podcast about Grand Theft Auto, has a newsletter about the games industry. So it also operates in niches where it can. In fact, my old haunted IGN started doing more in this area. Its acquisition of Gamer Network, yes, it gave it a big website in Eurogamer, but also gave it a dedicated PC games site in Rock Paper Shotgun, a games tech outlet in Digital Foundry, and a business site in gamesindustry.biz. Google's algorithm changes, as Dawkins mentioned earlier, is supposed to prioritize websites that offer expertise and speciality, which would theoretically benefit niche websites. And we're also seeing some rise in games journalists that are launching their own newsletters, launching podcasts through platforms such as Substack, all specializing in specific areas. You're listening or watching one of those right now. To talk more about this, my final interview was with Alex Donaldson. Alex straddles both worlds. He's one of the leaders of VG247, a mainstream media outlet run by IGN, but he's also the founder and owner of RPG Site, which is a strong, profitable media business that started off as a Final Fantasy fan site. So I was eager to get his thoughts on the state of things. There's certain independent websites that are disappearing.
Yep.
And there's others like yourselves, which is doing very, very well. Trying to put that into question form, I guess, what do you see as the problems or the challenges that's going on at the moment?
Well, I mean, very, very well is all relative, right? Like, I would say we're doing well by our standards and by what I believe and what my business partner believes we need to do. And so that's the first key component, right? Is it's about expectation. So when we talk about indie publishing specifically, I can see a few challenges. One is that there just aren't as many indie publishers anymore. There were a few brands that went on really big buying sprees over the course of a couple of years. And when I say that, the average person is probably going to think more about things, about larger acquisitions like Gamer Network going to Breedpop and then Ziff Davis. But I'm more thinking about Gamers Group buying websites like Silicon Era and buying websites on that sort of level. And in that, you had a lot of those mid-tier websites disappear. If we're talking in football terms, right, it's like, yeah, you've got your Premier League teams, which is your websites like your Eurogamers or, your IGN, stuff like that, whatever. But in the games media, those middle leagues have really shrunk and really contracted. And then down in the football terms, we're staying with the football thing, down in the conference where you've got people playing on weekends and stuff, that's actually doing okay, I think. But that's hobbyist. People aren't necessarily making any money. People aren't even necessarily monetizing. But that middle bracket has really been squeezed. And I guess that's kind of similar to video games, right? In the sense that you've got the massive games now and the indie games. You've got GTA 6 and you've got Balatro. And actually the games that are in the middle are relatively few and far between. But, and this is where I think the parallel continues, and I can't believe I'm only thinking of this parallel now as I'm talking. Like, I didn't pre-think this. But obviously we've just had Clair Obscur come out, right, and be a huge success, which is a really important game for our website as well. And that's interesting because that's your single A game, I guess you might call it, or whatever. And when you do get those and they're done right, there's a massive audience for them. People are really interested in them. People forgive them for being shorter, for perhaps being not quite as polished, whatever. And so I think there's a similar thing going on in games media where people do want a website like an RPG site or a Video Games Chronicle or what have you, or Gematsu.
To extend your comparison to the development scene, obviously the reason why Clair Obscur Expedition 33 did very well because it's a sort of style of game that you don't get too much of, right? Yeah. And it's the same with reason why Space Marine 2, which was, I guess, AA, not really AAA, but it looks AAA. It's definitely made not on a AAA budget. It was made on a relatively big budget. But that obviously did a thing that was like, we're going to make a game for an audience that's this. Helldivers 2 did the same thing. These games that went and did very, very well. And because they focused in on maybe a niche or a specific area, they happened to blow out there. And of course, what you're talking about, your site is a niche. And one of the things that I'm getting out of this a little bit is that being specific and specialist and niche.
We still play in the big pit with the big guys. So we're a role-playing specific video game website. So we, for the most part, only cover role-playing games. The rule is actually really, we cover role-playing games and games that we know RPG players love. So a really good example is we got really bored of everyone asking us where our Zelda review was whenever there was a new Zelda. And eventually we just went, screw it, we're just going to cover Zelda. It's not an RPG, but we get it. People were interested in that. Well, like Phoenix Wright is another good example, like adventure games. We sort of venture into that. But mostly we're in this role-playing niche and we're serving that niche. And I think something that has happened and that is ongoing is Google is sort of making a decision that they quite like the idea of a smaller internet, which is ironic considering the state of Google. And who knows where this is going to go if Search gets broken off and stuff like that. We've got all this antitrust stuff going on. But they've sort of decided this idea. They don't necessarily like sending 80% of the internet's traffic to the top 5% of websites. There are some exceptions like Reddit. They love Reddit, stuff like that. And you've seen that in sort of, probably, I think, the single biggest story in games media in the last year. Forget all the acquisitions, not forget all the job losses, but put them to one side for one moment. Is there's a company, GLHF, which is the guy who runs it day to day is a former colleague of mine, Kirk, who you will know as well. And GLHF basically provides video game coverage for mainstream brands. So they did The Sun for a while and things like that. And they did Sports Illustrated. They did video games at Sports Illustrated. And it was tremendously successful, hugely successful. Video games at Sports Illustrated was bigger than a lot of traditional video game websites. You speak to games media, they will say, that sounds terrible, it's bad, da, 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 da. I think John said something to that effect on the episode you had with him and Kat as guest hosts. But suddenly Google decided overnight, and Sports Illustrated got a message in their Google web tools saying, this is domain abuse, because the idea is you're using the popularity and the strength and the ranking ability of the Sports Illustrated domain to make the video game content rank higher and thereby stealing clicks from the video game experts. And so the Sports Illustrated guys panicked, because when you get a strike like that, if you don't act, it can literally kill the entire website. So it could kill the entire, this huge brand that, had a prestigious magazine name attached and all sorts. So they literally overnight deleted the entire video game section.
Wow.
And GLHF, they had loads of people working on that section. All those people had to be let go. Terrible. And what's interesting there is, so you can look at that one of a few ways. Video game specialists can go, yes, Google is finally saying they want video game specialists to cover video games. Great, fine. You could also look at it as, oh my God, this is terrible, because GLHF was doing things the right way. They were actually getting video game experts, people who were video game journalists from the specialist side, to come and do the coverage on this mainstream site and do really high quality coverage. And they still got whacked. The end result, though, I think, is that if you're a specialist and you really zero in on something, Google is starting to really appreciate it. But obviously, that's only one side of things. Like, I think a big problem in the industry is a reliance on Google, a reliance on traffic from this one company that controls way too much of the internet. Because if they decide they don't like you, they decide they don't like your app presentation, they decide they don't like something about your design, whatever. And a lot of this is not decided by a human, it's decided by a machine. We're having it right now, having really, like, as you and I record this, over the weekend, there's been really seismic shifts, which suggest Google has made changes to the algorithm. And over the weekend, I've been getting texts from website owners, from editors going, how's your traffic? What's going on? Have you noticed any changes? We're noticing changes. Panicking, terrified, because they can rip the carpet out from under a business and take it away. And that's why the key thing is, the answer's really gone away from me now. I apologize. But the really key thing is, you've got to build content that isn't necessarily just for Google. And I think the best place to do that is on smaller, more focused niche websites.
The reason why they rely on Google is because, it's because the way this is monetized, right? I mean, if it's all about advertising, you need traffic. And if traffic is, and don't get me wrong, I think the whole media world would be a hell of a lot better if we all just paid for our media, right? Like we used to back in the magazine days.
Agree.
But every time I've spoken to, I've always gone like, is there a way that we can not be reliant on Google? And when you talk about the subscription model, and maybe it works in your world, and maybe you can talk about that. But in particularly the bigger brand worlds, it barely makes a dent compared to the programmatics.
Remember, all that Google is a traffic acquisition method. Mm-hmm. Because all you're doing is using Google to acquire the traffic, and then that traffic you're monetizing with ads. You can monetize that traffic in a different way, which is where we get into subs or whatever else. And it's always going to be an alchemy. So Yes. So you do have games media brands out there, independent or large, where literally 95% of their traffic can come from Google. That is, I think, where you're in the danger zone. A big part of what we've tried to do on RPG over the years is chip that away to get that Google percentage down with more direct traffic, a dedicated audience, more traffic from the highly followed social media channels, whatever. I think if you build an audience, I mean, I'll put it this way. I know that RPG site reviews can traffic more, can have more social traction than reviews on websites that are maybe 4 or 5 times the size of RPG site. And that's because people actually recognize the site, they recognize what it's about, they trust it. Like if you look at a game like Clair Obscur, which you mentioned earlier, there are totally RPG fans who specifically wait for and seek out our verdicts. And God, don't I know it when a publisher doesn't provide review code early enough and we run a review late, because as soon as the embargo release, we've got people banging down our door going, where's yours? And the funny thing, I suppose, is that you and I will recognize is, I think this mindset was common in like magazines in the past. From a British perspective, you, in my view, you were a person who specifically trusted the reviews of N64 magazine or ONM, and you sort of were one of those teams. And of course, you look at Edge, and so much of that magazine's power has been built. Obviously, it's been built off great writing, but it's been built off that institutional trust of the brand, right? And these things are all related. So it's not to say there isn't great writing in online games media, but I think a lot of the large scale stuff now is an absolute content factory. And I don't say that in a pejorative way, in the way people use the content farm. Don't get me wrong, lots of crappy farms exist too. But like, I think the approach on big websites is a lot of content, and we want to cover everything, and so on and so forth. And that approach has led to the idea of seeking out a specific site's verdict has declined, apart from like YouTubers and things like that, or Twitch streamers. Even online brands that used to have that sort of reputation, I can think of online brands that people thought of that way, that people no longer do, which shows sort of the shift, I think.
Yeah, what I find really interesting, and I haven't articulated this in my head in any way, so I'm sort of going to waffle a little bit, but there was a time, you're right, I read N64 magazine, but N64 magazine, even though it was a journalistic publication, it had a personality to it. And I read it because, online publications are relatively faceless. You can get an IGN, the way everyone chases the big games now, you'll have an article from IGN giving Assassin's Creed Shadows a 9 or whatever. And then you'll get another opinion piece from IGN saying they didn't really like Assassin's Creed Shadows. And you're like saying, hang on, I'm very confused by the publication stance. The point is, it isn't the publication stance, it's the individual journalist stance, which is fine. Yeah. It kind of takes away that ability to build an audience and a community, maybe. But then you're starting to see these more established journalists, and I don't really include myself in this, but you can do. People like Stephen Tortillo and those sort of people who've gone, I'm going to go down the route of basically making a media publication where I'm the sort of brand, which is almost an influencer approach.
Yeah, it is.
In terms of an individual, but it has a certain flavor and a certain style to it. And when they do bring in, freelancers to it, they sort of have to fit in with that style. And then they're funded by the community themselves through, that's not the case for me, but it's the case for Stephen and stuff, where they're charging the community for it. I actually quite like that, even though it probably is resulting in lots of job losses at the moment. I quite like that idea in principle of a sort of media that people are, you can fund through various different measures that isn't reliant on Google. And that goes back to your game metaphor that you were talking about earlier, about how video games today, they're not driving audience growth by sticking ads on Facebook. I mean, they are doing that a bit, or ads on the TV or anything like that. Or they're doing it by creating Discord communities and building up things through Discord or through Twitch or whatever those platform they choose to target with their game. And they're building communities that way and then selling to that community and then letting that community spread out the games. And I guess, I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying, but it certainly feels like it sort of ties in with your becoming less reliant on Google and building things up through the community.
But if you can build a bit of an audience, it's huge. I mean, it can be small potatoes, by the standards of a GameSpot or an IGN, it really is small potatoes. But if you're a small business, as I am, or as I lead, with a turnover that can maybe support 4 or 5 full-time people or an equivalent level of freelance or permalancer budget-wise, that little bit of dedicated audience can change the face of the business. And don't be wrong, I'm not saying that is all our business. Obviously, we have guides and stuff. But as with anything, it's a complex alchemy. So a lot of the times, our guides will provide the funding for content that is essentially a loss leader to make sure we stay on top of being a really definitive coverage for RPGs, covering lots of small games that barely anybody buys. And even for the guides, it's like we've pivoted. Ironically, this is our time is a flat circle, right? So we entered this world where guides became, and when I think of this, I think of Destiny, I think of Pokemon Go, I think of the period when VG 24/7 specifically pivoted to guides, and they started doing a lot of stuff that many other sites began to do as well. It was using Google Trends and answering people's queries and doing lots of guides that are 300, 400, 500 words long that answer a specific question. Now we've got the Google AI summaries, and basically that's taken that away. And our strategy for that has been essentially stop writing content that could be summarized by AI. So instead of writing a guide that answers a question that can be summarized in 100 words and thereby the AI can summarize it, we go in and we say, we're going to go back to the old school. We want to do really nice, full, in-depth walkthroughs. We call them like minimalist walkthroughs. So they're still the full game on one page, but it's not like over the top. It's not hand-holding. It really just takes a step back, step down from the hardcore game FAQ stuff. But the end result is people really like those. And so we have two things happen. One is that we get a lot of search traffic off them. We target very carefully. We pick our battles very carefully about what games we're going to do it for. Again, this comes with being small, where if you're a big site, you go, well, there's no point in paying someone X amount to spend 60, 70, 100 hours doing a walkthrough for this really long RPG, when it's an RPG that's only going to sell 500,000 copies, and therefore what's the point? We might as well put them on 500 Oblivion pages instead. I get it. So that's where, and that's great because that actually opens a door up for us. But the crucial thing is that content can't be summarized by AI. So it does well on Google. But in addition, people have come to love those minimalist walkthroughs. So now we get messages. We got one literally this morning, and got an email off someone to the staff inbox going, are you planning to do one of your walkthroughs for such and such a game? Because I really love using your stuff. And that doesn't happen really on bigger websites ever. Having worked a lot on bigger websites as well, that just doesn't happen. And the number of people I've given the advice of, just step back and do your own thing. But even then, it can be difficult because making money is about lots and lots of different things. So it's really hard. Two great friends of mine and a friend of yours, Andy on VGC, and then Sal, who runs Gamatsu. Like, those guys are completely dedicated to news. And I'll be flat out, like, news is a hell of a lot more difficult to monetize and make money off, because the value of a page to a user in terms of a page impression on the ad is in part determined by how long people are on the page. So if people are hitting a news story, reading half a paragraph and bouncing after 30 seconds, that page is worth a lot less money than a big old article that people stay on for 5 minutes, or a guide. Like, we've got guides on RPG site with dwell times of 20, 25, 30 minutes, which is insane. But that sort of helps to massage all the news that people just bounce at, which is why it's this alchemy. You've got to have a little bit of everything within reason. But this is why it's so difficult, because you've got to have a bit of everything. But if you do too much, you're screwed. And so I feel like the parallels with game development in that sense, with like lower scale game development, or to be fair, the parallels between AAA game development and mega sites is also similar. Although the one thing I would say in the media is I have for a long time, for nearly 20 years, since I was a teenager, been of the belief that you're better off with a smaller ship that can turn quickly than with a Titanic. I've got friends who have worked on websites where they've seen the iceberg come in, but it's been too late to turn, and that's it. Whereas at least if you've got small ships, and actually if you're a media brand, a broader media brand, if you've got several small ships and one of them sinks, you're still okay. And I think that's also why you've had companies like Gamers Group have a great interest in websites the size of RPG Site or Silicon Era or Gamatsu or Push Square or VGC for acquisition, because what they see there is a small ship that they can keep floating. But then the problem is you end up with a big company and they make loads of silly changes, and the thing that made the small ship viable goes.
You mentioned Google's AI changes.
Yes.
How much of a problem is that?
So here's the thing. I think there is a certain type of way that people have been doing things and a certain type of content that is essentially not going to work anymore as long as this system remains the way it is. At that point, people have to move on. And that has happened before. Like, there was a world when we didn't do the sort of guides that we've done for the last 10, 15 years. There was a world when forums and message boards were the sort of revenue driver for a lot of sites, where they'd have a big old message board and then an editorial site would exist to the side and actually not be making any money. So people are going to have to move and rethink, but I don't think it's sophisticated enough. And AI can summarize what the overall review position is. So maybe an AI is dangerous to OpenCritic, to Metacritic, whatever, but it can't give you one really strong opinion from someone that you trust, or one really strong opinion from, I'm an RTS fan and I want to read the verdict of a hardcore RTS fan on this new Command and Conquer Spiritual Successor. I'm a hardcore RPG fan and I want to read about specifically the RPG mechanics in The Witcher 4, not the broad strokes that you're going to get from a big brand. And so the AI can't replicate any of that. So I'm less concerned about that. I think the bigger AI threat is sort of in the language models that are going to be able to summarize a lot of content or rewrite content. We have enough problems with plagiarism as it is. Probably every single story that gets posted to RPG site gets scraped and re-uploaded to at least 25 different websites. And now they're in a position where they can start using AI to rewrite. And I do think there'll be a time will come where there'll be some up and coming games media brand, and we'll get 6 months into them being quite significant and people will realize that it's just a load of AI rewrites and then the editor's just using that to get free copies of games from PR. I'm less concerned about the Google search AI. We'll see. I could be wrong on that. But also my business is not built. Like I said, our strategy for a while has been to not write stuff generally. News is different, but for guides and features to really not write stuff that can be summarized or replicated by AI.
We're conscious of the time. We've taken up so much time. What have I missed, Alex?
But I mean, it's the challenge really is, and this is a challenge for the whole industry, right? Is what's going on in games media from big brands down to indie is a problem of talent retention and a problem of talent acquisition. And these are deadly because it means you've got the drain at both ends, because it's harder than ever for indies to make it work, which means you're getting less young people through the door. And at the top, there's not enough money, there's not enough progression. And so people go to publishers, people go to PR. And the thing I always hear is, where are we going to get video games? I was chatting to someone at BAFTA about this. Where are we going to get video games Mark Kermode? Where are we going to get video games Roger Ebert? And the answer is, who knows if we'll ever get them? Because no one gets to that level of experience, or very few people get to that level of experience. Or people get to that level of experience and they sort of age out of the traditional journalism and criticism game to do something like what Stephen is doing, or like what Patrick Klepik's doing, or like what Jason Schreier's doing. Or they end up in a position like myself or Andy, where you're running a website and you maybe get to write a little bit, but a lot of your time is spent bogged down with boring business stuff. And so these are the key things we've got to fix. The talent acquisition thing is we need more small independent brands. Best things that people can do for that is they can support independent brands, whether that is visiting, reading, subscribing, following on Blue Sky, whatever, for these smaller games media brands. The other thing is, a lot of people who listen to, who watch this, are going to be people who are in a position to tip the scales and this sort of thing. Give support to small brands in terms of access and things like that. Be one of the publishers that understands the power of a well-placed article with a small brand as opposed to a poorly placed article on a massive brand.
If you're a publisher or a developer and you're going, yeah, but isn't working with an individual niche website, isn't that ultimately the equivalent of working with an individual niche influencer or in those spaces?
It could be. I always think of, he's now retired to go off and do something else, but the channel still exists under new people. But Eric's brilliant, but like the biggest Monster Hunter fanboy expert you could ever imagine. So Eric's would always be there for Monster Hunter stuff. Even though he was a YouTuber, he would be in the mix with the regular media. I went on a Monster Hunter World preview trip to Osaka with Capcom, and it was a bunch of traditional media and Eric's. And that makes perfect sense because he's an expert. So I think, yeah, you can work with individual influencers. What I would say, if you were our advertising publisher, coming to me, as they often do, and saying, we need a pitch for some sponsored content for this company, for X new game, from Y franchise. And I know in that scenario, I'm basically up against two things. RPG in that instance is up against YouTubers who can provide similar, or very big brands who can provide similar but on a different scale and stuff like that. And my argument in that pitch would be, yes, well, the YouTubers tend to be a bit more narrow. So there are some RPG specific YouTubers, but a lot of the times they are Destiny YouTubers or Final Fantasy YouTubers or whatever. So it's, someone who does Destiny, I don't know, or Final Fantasy Union, biggest Final Fantasy YouTube channel, run by a lovely couple. So my argument would be, we do a bit of everything. So if you are, stick with Final Fantasy, right? If you're Square Enix and you're marketing Final Fantasy 17, yes, you can go and do a big thing with a Final Fantasy YouTuber, and that might be well placed. But all I'll say is, we don't just have the Final Fantasy people. We've got all the Persona kids who you have been unable to reach. We've got the Mass Effect people who you would like to reach, or the BioWare people, or whatever. And so that's what I would say.
Be niche. But this whole conversation is be niche, not too niche. It's
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that is totally it, because niche is beautiful and you can own a niche and kill it, but you've got to find that balance, because if you're too niche, you're never going to be a viable business.
So the games media is certainly going through a seismic shift, just like the rest of the industry. In fact, I love what Alex was saying there about how the games media world is sort of going through a similar thing to the rest of the games industry. But just like the rest of the games industry, there are pockets of success, particularly in niche areas. We'll be covering this world moving forward. Expect to hear a lot more about this in the year ahead. For now, that's it for this week's episode of the Game Business Show. We'll be back later in the week with our news and analysis show. To make sure you don't miss that, head to thegamebusiness.com and put in your email address for free to make sure you get an email about it. Until then, thank you for tuning in.